Well, Boker Tov, and welcome into the Mishkan Katan studio this morning. As always, it's a pleasure to be with you and to study the scriptures together. Now, if you've been tuning in the past several weeks, I would say about the past 4 weeks, I've been sharing with you about my recent trip to Israel. It was a 2 week trip, and I've been sharing with you these past few broadcasts about that. Today, we're going to talk about day 5 of the trip, and I hope that you'll enjoy hearing about today's experiences. Now, I've been doing some weird things in my recent broadcasts, not by choice, not by design. I've actually been having calamities while I've been broadcasting live. So hopefully, in today's broadcast, that can be avoided. I apologize that in my last broadcast, I dropped my phone and it startled me so bad I screamed into the microphone. So if you were the recipient of that, my sincere apologies. And then the time before that, I inadvertently muted the microphone by touching the end of it without meaning to, and not even realizing I did it, so that the last 13 minutes of that broadcast were in pantomime. So hopefully today we will avoid those types of calamities. Well, on day 5 of our group trip, and remember, I was with about 39 other people and with 3 tour guides. There were also some of those tour guides were rabbis and very knowledgeable and well respected rabbis. So it was really wonderful to get to learn from them. But on day 5, the first place we stopped in the land of the great king was a small national park at Chorazin, the ancient city of Chorazin. And what we did there was we explored the ruins of that ancient town. Now, if you remember, if the name of that town sounds familiar to you, then it's because what you're hearing is you're remembering that this was one of the towns that Yeshua cursed during his earthly ministry. He said, "Woe to you, Chorazin and Bethsaida." And he pronounced this woe upon them because of their unbelief. Both of these towns were in the Galilee area where he did most of his ministry. And even though he did incredible miracles among them, the unbelief of the people was great. And so he cursed them as a result. And you can read about that in Matthew 11:20. Now, when we visited the park, we walked among the ruins of that first century community of Jews. And it's on the north, I believe it's on the northwest side of the Kinneret, but don't quote me on that. I may be wrong about that, but it's on the side of a mountain looking over the Sea of Galilee. And so Chorazin was a port city on the Sea of Galilee. And so when we went into the ruins, our first stop was the ancient synagogue there. It was first excavated in 1905, and it took a couple of years. The archaeologist who did the excavation was a German man, and then in the 1920s and from the 1920s through about 1939, the Department of Antiquities of Hebrew University in Jerusalem continued the excavation. Now, the front of the synagogue is facing south. Why do you believe that is? Well, You know, if you're in the United States of America and you're a Torah observant believer in Yeshua, or if you're full on Jewish in your faith, then when you pray, you may face the east. Why would you face the east? Because Jerusalem is to your east. It doesn't matter where you live in the United States of America, Jerusalem is to your east. There's a verse in Jeremiah 17:12, and it says, "A glorious throne exalted from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary." And this verse reflects the practice of facing toward Jerusalem, when praying. Well, Chorazin was north of Jerusalem. So therefore, the people in Chorazin, which direction did they face? They faced south. So the front of the synagogue was facing south, so that the people, as they stood and looked toward the front of the synagogue, they were facing Jerusalem. So as they said their prayers, while they said their prayers, they were facing south. They were facing the front of the synagogue. All right. So the synagogue was facing Jerusalem because why? Because Jerusalem is known in the Bible, it's specified as the throne of God. The Holy of Holies was the throne room of God. He became present between the cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat. So the throne of God was in Jerusalem. And a lot of people still say that the throne of God is still in Jerusalem. So there were many steps leading up to the front of the synagogue. And these steps are staggered and uneven, as are the southern steps near where the temple used to stand in Jerusalem. The steps were not even the same distance in depth. And the reason for that was so that people would not go bounding up them like a gazelle, because the idea was, both in Chorazin and in Jerusalem and in other places, I'm sure, to take your time and be contemplative, be meditative, slow down, and concentrate as you're ascending the steps into the temple. Synagogues of the temple era, of the Second Temple era, mimicked in design the temple in Jerusalem. They were little microcosms of the temple in Jerusalem. For example, the temple in Jerusalem had many pilasters. A pilaster was an ornate column. And there in Chorazin, you saw some pilasters as well. Some of these pilasters were in the Corinthian style of column. Others were in the Ionic style. And there's one other style of pilaster or of column, but for the moment, I can't think of what that third one was. Most of the temple's pilasters, which have been excavated, have been in the Ionic style, and the ones at Chorazin were in the Ionic style as well. Back to the point about the way the front face of the temple at Chorazin was facing. When we were at Gamla, I talked about Gamla a couple of sessions ago. When we were at Gamla, the synagogue did not have a front facade that faced toward Jerusalem. And that has been a topic that has been discussed for hundreds of years as to why that might have been. It was so common for temples, synagogues to face toward toward Jerusalem. it's been unclear why the synagogue at Gamla did not follow that practice. But the synagogue at Capernaum, on the other hand, is almost identical to the synagogue at Chorazin. Now, Capernaum and Chorazin were not that far apart, so it's no surprise that their synagogues would have been similar. But the one at Capernaum today, the Roman Catholic Church built an ultra 1960s style church building over the ruins at Capernaum. And ostensibly, they did that to preserve the ruins. Capernaum is a huge tourist attraction today, whereas Chorazin is not so famous as a tourist attraction. Um, Capernaum was where the apostle Peter lived. And of course, Peter was deemed by the Roman Catholic Church, the church that was established in the 300s AD, 300s CE, as the official religion of Constantinople. The Roman Catholics really revered and still do revere the Apostle Peter. So since that was like his home church, they really built an elaborate church there, and they've done a lot of stuff there. So the synagogue at Capernaum, you can see down through the floor of that church. It looks like a spaceship. It's kind of up on stilts, like a spaceship might be up on legs, and you can look down through the glass floor and see the ruins of the actual synagogue. All right, well, that's Capernaum, but Chorazin is not near that popular. Now, in the ruins of the synagogue at Chorazin, let's get back there in our thinking. One of the rabbis on our trip showed to us the teva seat, what you might call the pulpit of the synagogue, the teva seat. And he remarked that the three purposes of gathering together at the synagogue have been and continue to be to gather and to have fellowship, to pray, and to study the Torah, the oral Torah and the written Torah, the latter of which is what is called by Christians the Old Testament. Of course, Torah means the instruction, so it can mean the Tanakh, the Old Testament. It can mean the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, or what some call the apostolic writings, what some call the newer covenant. So all of that is Torah, okay? Now, Jews who practice in the Reformed tradition, the emphasis is more on the first purpose of gathering in the synagogue, which is to gather and to fellowship. But for those in the conservative and the Orthodox traditions, the emphasis is on the latter two purposes. Now, I noticed that there was a wine press in the ruins, but our tour guides didn't stop to dwell or to linger at the wine press. When we went to these sites, we didn't give equal amounts of time to every feature, shall we say, of the site. I'll give you another example. We went to a park that some call Agrippina, and we spent some time there. Well, there at Agrippina, there is a Roman fortress, and it's very well known, but for the sake of time, we didn't have time to go through that. And that was true for a lot of the places we went. We went through a beautiful park at Tel Dan. I told you about it a couple of days, 2 or 3 days ago, as far as 2 or 3 broadcasts ago. I say days, but I'm thinking of days in my trip. Okay. But 2 or 3 broadcasts ago, and they had this pool, and kids were cavorting in the pool, and it would have been fun to take off our shoes and wade in the pool, but there just wasn't time to do everything. Okay. We had a schedule, we had to stick to it, and pretty much we did. So we didn't see absolutely everything. So we didn't talk about the wine press at Chorazin. But another thing that we saw there um, was the house of mikvot. Now, many of you listeners know what mikvot are. Mikvot is the plural of mikvah. Um, and a mikvah is basically a bathing pool. And so the house of mikvot contained mikvahs for the entire community. And as again, many of you know, the mikvah is a place of ritual immersion in Judaism, and regular immersion into a mikvah is needed for ritual purity. So mikvot are all over ancient Israel. There are modern day mikvot that are still in use. There are ancient mikvot which are not in use. So to practically every set of Jewish ruins to which we went, there were mikvot here and there because they were and are so important to ritual purity. Now, what is meant by that? If you are a Christian, this concept is very foreign to you. We were listening in our weekly worship service this past Sunday as our pastor talked about baptism. And then we baptized a young man after the service. Well, for many Christians, you get baptized and that's it. Now, Baptists believe that baptism should be total immersion, and that's very similar to immersion in a mikvah. However, the reasons for the immersion are very different. In the Christian tradition, baptism is done as a sign or a symbol of the person's faith in Yeshua. In some Christian traditions, and I'll be flat out clear to say I don't agree with this, babies are baptized. Well, the reason that is done is to indicate that the parents will raise the child in the Christian faith. But my belief is you can't suck your faith out of a baby bottle. Each person has to make an informed decision about his or her faith on his or her own terms under the leading of the Holy Spirit. So a symbol, using baptism as that symbol, I personally don't believe that's how it was intended. Honestly, I believe that the first baptisms drew out of the mikvah teaching that is taught in the Torah. And Yeshua went down into the Jordan to be baptized. I believe he was immersed because it said when he came up out of the water, the Holy Spirit descended on him like a dove. So in the Christian tradition, the purely Christian tradition, baptism is done as a sign, as a symbol. But in the Old Testament and in the practice of the first century Jews and Jews leading up to the first century, and I believe that ritual purity immersion in a mikvah was done by the first century followers of Yeshua as well. So the idea was that both men and women had to immerse in the mikvah at various times. So, for example, there were these ritual immersions that were the result of the functions of the sexual organs. Okay, so for a woman, for example, she had to immerse in the mikveh at the end of her monthly cycle. When it had ended and was about to start over again, she would go ritually immerse. Okay. If a man had an emission during the night, he had to, while he was sleeping, he had to ritually immerse. The priests in the temple had to ritually immerse at various times before they began to perform their duties. So there were various commands given in the book of Leviticus which indicated when people were supposed to ritually immerse. And one of our rabbis said that actually the mikvot were as important as the synagogue. Because why? Okay, a woman would not be allowed to have relations with her husband until she had ritually immersed at the end of her cycle. So if a woman couldn't ritually immerse, there could be no relations. You have no relations, you have no children. You have no children, then the people die out. Okay, so that sounds rather extreme, but uh, Yahweh, Father God, put a very strong emphasis on this. So Torah observant believers in Yeshua today, many ritually immerse when they're supposed to. Okay. So today, however, today's mikvot are very much like spas. Some of them are quite luxurious. Now, I can't say that I've been to a functioning mikveh, but some of my friends have. All right. So next, we went to stand in the ruins of the town square. And one of our rabbis, while we were standing there, explained that one of the more important activities that would take place there in the town square would take place 3 times a year. Some of you may be already guessing what I'm about to talk about. It was on the occasion just before the men and some of the women would make the journey to Jerusalem for the 3 regalim festivals. Now, what does regalim mean? The word regalim in Hebrew is the plural for the singular word regal, which meant foot. So regalim means feet. So what are the 3 feet festivals? Well, those are the festivals that all Jewish men ages 2 and up would walk on foot to the city and be there, be present there, and participate in those 3 festivals. Pesach was the first one in the religious year. Next was what? Shavuot, 50 days later. And then in the fall, we had what? Sukkot, booths, tabernacles. All right. So those were the 3 regalim festivals. All right. So the community would gather there, and every family would be represented. There were 24 districts in ancient Israel, and representatives from all 24 districts would go. In fact, as many of the community members as could go would go to Jerusalem for these regalim festivals. The population of Jerusalem would swell tremendously, and the areas around the city would swell as well. And there they would camp out unless they had relatives there in Jerusalem, or in Bethlehem, or in Bethany, or in another little outskirt of Jerusalem, whose house they could stay in for the festival. Otherwise, they would camp out for the duration of the festival. Come and let us go up to the house of the Lord, the psalm says. Why does it say up? Because, wait a minute, wasn't Chorazin further up north of Jerusalem? Yes, it was. Yes, it was. But in order to get to Jerusalem, you had to go up to Jerusalem because it was on a hill. It was on a hill, actually on hills, Mount Moriah, Mount Zion, um, to name two. All right. Okay. So come and let us go up to the house of the Lord. You may have heard of the Psalms of Ascent. And oh my goodness, I'm about to embarrass myself. I think they're like Psalms 113 through 118, somewhere around in there. But those are called the Psalms of Ascent. Why were they called that? Because these are the Psalms that the people would sing as they walked up to Jerusalem for these regalim festivals. And there was an order of procession in which they went. They didn't say, okay, grab your knapsack and let's go. No, there was a specified order in which they went. First, a Cohen, a priest, would be in front and he would be playing a flute. And then would come the community offering, that is, the livestock that they were going to be taking to sacrifice at the festival. And then next would come the other Kohanim, the other priests. And behind the priests would be the male and female singers of the choir. And they would be the ones who would be singing the Psalms of Ascent. And most of the time, they were sung antiphonally. Do you remember the psalm that has the repeated phrase, his mercy endures forever? And it's repeated, it'll say, do 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 do. His mercy endures forever. Do 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 do. His mercy endures forever. That is an example of call and response or antiphonal singing. So several of the Psalms of Ascent would be antiphonal psalms. Now, Tractate Bikurim, chapter 3 of the Mishnah, tells us about this order of procession. So if you've never heard this before, you can read more about it in Tractate Bikurim of the Mishnah. And a similar procession takes place today still for Jewish weddings. All right, so we left Chorazin after that. It's a beautiful park. And we journeyed on to the mountaintop city of Safed. Some call it Safed. It was pronounced Safat in Hebrew, I believe. It's Tzfat, almost like there's no sa at the beginning, Tzfat. In my blog, I spelled it Tsfat. So there are various spellings of it. Honestly, I had never heard of this city. I know I was ignorant and still am about a lot of things. Okay, I'm a lifelong learner, like I imagine lots of you are, because if you weren't, you would not be listening to this broadcast. Okay, but I'd never heard of Safat. Safat is a city that is at a higher elevation than Jerusalem. What about that? And it's a city that, like Jerusalem, is built on very steep mountain grades. It's not a mesa city like Masada. If you've heard of the national park called Masada, Masada was built on a flat-topped mountain, not Sfat. Sfat is built on the sides of a mountain. And when we were standing on the top of Mount Arabel, or Mount Arbel, some pronounce it, we could look across the Jordanian plain and see the city of Safat. Okay, so because Safat is at a higher elevation than Jerusalem, there's this legend or pervasive belief that Safat is closer to God. And for example, Safat is a very Orthodox city, all right? And there's a shul there in Safat. I don't know if it's actually a university, but it's an institute of higher learning. And I talked to some people in our group who wanted to come to Safat for 2 or 3 weeks and take some courses there. But it's a very conservative city. It's inhabited mostly by Orthodox Jews. And for hundreds of years, Sfat has been the center of Jewish mysticism, otherwise known as Kabbalah. Some pronounce it Kabbalah, but the Sephardic pronunciation, and I study Sephardic Hebrew, is Kabbalah. Well, Kabbalah began actually in Genesis 1:1, when we read about the divine mystery, the Father, the Son, otherwise known as the Word or divine wisdom, and the Holy Spirit, the divine mystery. That is somewhat mystic, okay? Who can understand that? Well, we had to dress more conservatively on our tour today so as not to offend the residents by our style of clothing. Women had to have on skirts or dresses that fell below the knee, and they had to have their shoulders and their arms covered down to their elbows. Now, interestingly enough, 2/3 of the Jews who live in Sfat are from America. They're Jews who have made Aliyah. And that made Aliyah, again, that may be a foreign term to some of you, but it's a term which means they immigrated to Jerusalem, to Safat, to Haifa, to Rishon LeZion, to various other cities, to Ariel, to Eilat, to Galilee, to any place in Israel, because the Kedushah of Israel is higher. The holiness of the land of Israel is higher than any other land on earth. So they immigrated, and that's what it means to make Aliyah. And you can only make Aliyah if you have Jewish heritage. Okay. All right. The phrase Aliyah comes from the Hebrew verb Allah, which means to ascend or to go up. And if you go live in Israel, you are living in a place with a higher level of holiness, of Kedushah. All right. Now, one of the reasons that Safat is popular is that properties in Sfat are 1/3 the price of properties in Tel Aviv, for instance. And Jerusalem is even more expensive a place to live than Tel Aviv, and has an even higher cost of living. So that's one of the reasons that Sfat has been a popular place for immigrants. Now, something you see a lot of in the city of Safat is sky blue paint on the buildings, the walls, the window casings, the floors, etc. And this is done, again, out of this belief or legend that Safat dwells in the heavens, dwells in the sky. And as far as overlords go, the British were mostly benevolent to the Jewish people. But after the documents were signed, turning Israel over to the Jews and to the residents who lived there in Israel, there were about 600,000 inhabitants living in the land at that time. And this sounds like an abrupt change of topic, but it's really not. So just hang with me here. And interestingly enough, in the Exodus from Egypt, there were about 600,000 men. Of course, there were women and children also. All right. So when the British left, they left very abruptly. They left on a Friday at midnight in 1948. In other words, they left right in the middle of the Shabbat, okay? And immediately, Muslims began to swarm in to the country. And Safat was one of those places where the Muslims began to swarm in. And so for 2 weeks, Safat was under siege. So a man named Yigdal Alon led the liberation of the city. He was the first head of the United Jewish Military. Now, the British did not clearly define the borders of their former holdings in the ancient Near East and the Middle East before they left, sadly. And although many former English held lands are still democracies today, there have been perhaps border disputes and wars that could have been preempted if they had done that, but they didn't. All right, so that's an interesting factoid about Safat, that as soon as the country was turned over to the Jews, Safat had to fight for its life, essentially. All right, so as we did at Chorazin, we visited the synagogue at Safat. Unlike the synagogue at Chorazin, which is a national park, the synagogue in Safat is a functioning, working synagogue. Now, the first exposure I ever had to a synagogue was on my second trip to Israel. And I got to walk into a Messianic synagogue, but it wasn't until this trip that I had actually been in a Orthodox Jewish synagogue. All right. And so the one at Safat, I want to tell you a little bit about it. It, as I said, is a fully functioning synagogue for a living, breathing Jewish community. The synagogue was originally established by Jews from Morocco, Sephardic Jews. And later, the synagogue was destroyed twice by earthquakes, and each time it was rebuilt. In 1927, it was destroyed by earthquakes for the third time. And the third time around, the best of precautions were taken to ensure that the structure will withstand the next earthquake. Our tour guide told us that about every 100 years, Israel sustains a major earthquake. Well, the last one was in 1927, and it was the one that destroyed the synagogue. So Israel is due, okay? We don't think about those things when we go visit. So some of my loved ones, not many of my loved ones, will watch this broadcast, okay? I don't tell them about this particular fact because they would worry over me going to Israel all the more if I did. All right. So Sephardic synagogues feature a design that is referred to as in the round. And this is the design even if the room is square or rectangular. As we saw in Chorazin, the Teva seat, the pulpit, is raised up above the worshipers, many of them, the men especially. The men and the women are separated, and at the synagogue there in Safat, the women's section was a balcony that was up above even the Teva, all right? And above the Teva and the majority of the room and above the women's balcony was a domed ceiling, which was painted most beautifully. It was odd to see Yeshua's Hebrew name painted into the dome of the synagogue, but his name, Yeshua, in Hebrew is salvation. So, salvation is not a concept that is foreign to the Jews, so it's not unusual that his name would be painted on the dome, inside of the dome of the synagogue, but it was just a little disconcerting. The Jews who worship in the synagogues there at Safat and elsewhere, of course, believe that Mashiach, Messiah, is yet to come, while those who've given their lives to Yeshua HaMashiach, Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah, folks like me believe that he has come and ever lives at the right hand of Father Yahweh, where he intercedes for us, and that he will come again. When I talk with Jews about Messiah coming, I'm talking about his return, his second advent, while they have in their mind an initial visit. In both cases, however, we believe that the next time that Mashiach comes to earth, he will usher in his earthly rule and reign. After we left the Safat synagogue, we had an hour or so to wander around, to shop, to get some lunch according to our preferences. And my friend Jay shared her lunch with me. I had packed for the trip several packages of nuts and trail mix and such. And we got and shared a pomegranate juice. And I ate my little packages of nuts and twigs. And she had brought a breakfast sandwich from breakfast with her. And so she shared that delicious egg sandwich with me. I have some wonderful memories of just breaking bread with brothers and sisters in Yeshua on this trip. One additional thing that was fascinating was that Orthodox Jewish men and boys would walk up to the men in our group and they would offer to show them how to wrap the tefillin and to wear the phylacteries on their foreheads, tools that Orthodox Jewish men use in their daily prayers. They assumed by us being there that we were Jewish in our faith. But I guess they get a lot of Jewish visitors who are not Orthodox and who don't practice or know about the wrapping of the tefillin, and it's done around the left hand and arm, and the putting on of the square box on the forehead with the band going around the head, the phylacteries. Okay. Now, most of the men on our trip already knew how to do these prayer rituals, but I just thought it was a curious thing that these men wanted to share this information with the men in our group. Well, one of the men in our group, although I know he knew how to do it because he was born into a Jewish family, he acquiesced and he allowed his arm to be wrapped and his head to bear briefly the phylactery, and the man from Safat prayed over him, and it was lovely to watch. I remember how amazing it was on the plane trip over to Israel, and we flew overnight. We left around 11:30 p.m. But I remember waking up at various times on the trip and seeing these Jewish men who were on the flight with us standing in the aisles, facing best they could determine toward Jerusalem, their shoulders clad with beautiful, long, elaborate talit, prayer shawls, wrapping their tefillin or holding their prayer books and praying. Both. I wanted to make sure I didn't mute the mic. I just touched the mic with my hand, and now I'm hypersensitive about that. But praying and holding their prayer books, and it was a very poignant experience to witness that. Another very poignant experience of this particular day was that before leaving Safat, we stopped by the home of one of Israel's most prominent rabbis. His name is Rabbi Avraham Greenbaum. Now, Rabbi Greenbaum is very elderly, and he's not in the best of health. In fact, he's wheelchair bound, and he lives with one of his children. I believe it's a son with whom he lives. Rabbi Greenbaum has been a wonderful musician over the years. He plays musical instruments and sings, and that resonates with me because I've been a musician ever since I was a child. But one of the rabbis in our group studied with Rabbi Greenbaum years ago, and the other two rabbis in our trip had never met him. And so we went to his apartment complex. Remember me telling you that in Israel, 85% of the people live in apartments. So we went to his apartment complex and we stood under the cover of a porch, all 39 of us. And the rabbi came down the elevator in his wheelchair. He came out to speak to us. And I thought about how all of the famous rabbis of the past, while they were well known in their day, um, I'm thinking of Rabbi Akiva, for example. He had, I think it was something like 25,000 followers or something. He had many followers. And while they were well known in their day, they didn't achieve their full place in the Jewish world until after their deaths. I wondered if that day that we met with Rabbi Greenbaum, if perhaps we were blessed to be blessed by this sweet, caring, loving man who could maybe one day be revered on the par with the Rambam, who many of you may recognize as a very famous rabbi from the Middle Ages. Rabbi Greenbaum practices a branch of Judaism that grew out of the founder of the Hasidic movement, and he enjoys focusing on the praise and worship aspects of his faith. And he has a website, which I will tell you about. I may have to spell it for you. It's azamara.org, and that's spelled Azamara. Lots of A's in that word. Azamara.org. So if you want to check out his website, he has some beautiful music there and some books and so forth. Psalm 146 says, I will sing to the Lord with all my strength. It doesn't say I will sing to the Lord if I have a pleasing voice, or I will sing to the Lord sometimes if the mood strikes me. It says with all my strength. And after he spoke to us and blessed us, one of our rabbis led the group in the song Ashira. It's a well-known Jewish song, which is a song of praise. And then that same rabbi prayed over Rabbi Greenbaum, who had blessed us. He had blessed our group. He had pronounced a blessing over our group. But one of the rabbis in the group, not the one that had studied with him, but another one, prayed over Rabbi Greenbaum for his health and vigor and well-being. Well, after we left Safat, we went on to the town of Meron, where we saw the tomb of the rabbi whom some believe wrote the Jewish Zohar, which is a Kabbalistic book of Judaism. Now, remember, I told you that Safat is the center of Jewish Kabbalah. Well, Kabbalistic is a word that comes from Kabbalah, right? And so this Zohar is a book of Jewish Kabbalah, right? And the rabbi, whom many believe wrote the Zohar, his name was Shimon bar Yochai. Shimon bar Yochai. And at his tomb, there were many devout Jewish men and women praying. The men and the women, used separate entrances, the Nashim and the Anashim. It reminded me a lot of the type of praying that you would see at the Kotel, the Western Wall. We only stayed a few minutes. Many of us prayed for miracles in our lives. In whatever area of life we need a miracle the most, I prayed for the spiritual health of my family. Many people believe that miracles are granted at the tomb of Shimon Bar Yochai. Um, but then after we left there, we took the bus back to the kibbutz. Remember, the kibbutz is the community in which our hotel was located, Kibbutz Lavi. And we had pretty much a shorter, less physically demanding day on this day. And that was a welcome respite. Um, this happened on a Friday, so the Shabbat was coming on, and that's another reason why we had a shorter day. And when I was on the trip, out of respect for very Torah observant Jews and Messianic believers, I didn't blog or post on the Shabbat. And so that evening, though, of course, we had the beginning of Shabbat. Now at the kibbutz, we weren't allowed to light the Shabbat candles in our rooms. So what they did was they set up many pairs of Shabbat candles down in the lobby. And so, traditionally, when you have the Shabbat, the welcoming in of the Shabbat, the women start all that off by lighting the Shabbat candles, and reciting the prayers while lighting the candles. And so most of the women that were staying at the kibbutz, they came down to the lobby and lit the candles and said the prayers. I had to read them because I don't have them memorized. But of course, most of the women there, having done this all of their adult lives as married women, they knew the prayers, and so they were reciting them over the candles. And then we had the synagogue service that night, and I will tell you more about that when we get together again. I think I'll just wait and tell you more about the Friday night service when I tell you about the Shabbat at Kibbutz Levi as a whole. And it was such an amazing experience for me because that was the first synagogue, Orthodox Jewish synagogue service I had ever attended, was that Friday night service. And it made such an impact on me. And there were some eye roller incidents. If you don't know me, I guess you're beginning to figure out that I seem to be one of those people that if it's going to happen to anyone, it will happen to me, muting the microphone when I hit it or dropping my phone and screaming and that sort of thing. But anyway, there were a couple of eye roller type incidents that I found myself involved in. But overall, it was a wonderful experience, which I will always treasure. So that ends our day 5 of our trip. And again, I hope you're enjoying following along on the recounting of the journey that I went on in June. You might call it a trip of a lifetime. And let's continue to pray for the country of Israel. I read yesterday, I believe it was, that the first, they called it gender affirming surgery, was just recently completed there. I don't call it gender affirming. I call it an affront to Almighty God. And it's just, that kind of thing is disturbing wherever it happens. But when it happens in the land of Israel, I just find it so disturbing. These sins and atrocities. It's just very disturbing to me. So let's remember to pray for the nation of Israel. Let's pray for the body of Messiah, the bride of Messiah, those of us who belong to his body, who are his bride. We're coming increasingly under attack. Let's pray for the Jewish people, not just the Jewish nation, but the Jewish people scattered all over the world, that they will come to know Mashiach, that they will recognize their Messiah. And so let's remember those things in prayer as we close this morning. And remember that you can find the text from which I do these videos. I always write my text out before I make my tape or before I do my live broadcast. And you can find that at my blog, which is resplendentdaughter.blogspot.com. And I'm saying that very deliberately, but like daughter is son and daughter, resplendentdaughter.blogspot.com, daughter of the king sort of thing. And so that's my blog. And then, of course, my Mishkan Katan address, because you're probably watching this on Mishkan Katan on messianiclambradio.com. That's www.messianiclambradio.com. And that's where you can catch me live on my weekly broadcast. Right now, it's on Wednesday mornings at 11 a.m. And then I do have a Resplendent Daughter Ministries Facebook page, and I always post my links there. And finally, I have a YouTube channel, which is Gina Hood 2818. My first name is spelled unlike most Ginas. It's Gena. So GenaHood 2818 is my YouTube channel. So those stay up. My videos stay up there. Of course, you can only watch my weekly Mishkan Katan video on Mishkan on Messianic Lamb Radio for 1 week. And then when I do another one, it rolls over and that one rolls off and the new one jumps in. So thank you for the privilege of being with you here. It is such a joy. I know I say that over and over, but it's just really true. I feel very blessed by our Father to be able to be here with you and to share with you. And I want to remind you that after we have explored the trip here together, I'll be returning to the book of Ruth, and we will finish up the book of Ruth together. So again, thank you. Have a wonderful week, and shalom, shalom, lahitraot.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.